second day, okay? And then go ahead and throw it in the washing machine. The next question I got is actually very interesting because it ties in to this washing routine thing. If you don't have a washing machine, what you can do to ensure that the pads are cleaned right is after you've done your cold rinse or cold soak, you can use your detergent like usual. And what you're going to do is, because you don't really want to do a twist, so when you're hand washing, you want to avoid doing the twisting motion as much as possible, as it tends to wear away at the threads. So what you're going to do a lot of is squeezing and basically rubbing together like that. And what some people say helps is to basically put the pad under the tap with the hot water, or fill the sink up with hot water. And after you've already done your cold rinse, I keep on stressing cold rinse because cold rinse is so important, or the cold soak is super important. Is you put it in the hot water. You can soak it in the hot water with the detergent for about 30 minutes to an hour, and then you can go in and basically do a hand wash. If you have a little brush, you can brush the top of it as well gently, to kind of work any stains out if there are any. My phone keeps crashing, so I don't know how much of the video is actually getting onto the stories. But another thing to also keep in mind is, as you are rinsing before the soap and after the soap, is to make sure that the water is actually running clear once you're doing that. If I'm doing a hand wash, I'm going to rinse my pads at least 3 or 4 times. And when I talk about rinsing, I'd probably do a soak again, just for the sake of it, because I want to get as much soap out as possible. But the good thing is, because most of my pads are made from cotton tops and cotton cores, you don't really need to do too much work to actually get them really clean, and blood isn't as dirty as we think it is, you know what I mean? So hand washing is perfectly fine. Cold rinse, warm water or hot water after, rinse very well. Also, I must stress, if you feel like I'm not going into enough details in my replies, send me a message and I can really go further if you still have questions after my brief. I said brief explanations, right? It's supposed to be brief. But yes, my inbox is open anyway for questions. And then once I have a moment to breathe, I will definitely get back onto you. And I don't mind to even do a phone call if necessary. I just thought I'd share what I do when I'm traveling with cloth pads. If I am traveling and I'm in a place where I can't use a washing machine, or I don't really want to be hand washing at the sink or soaking, I'd literally, at the end of my day, as I'm having my shower, I would do a simple cold rinse before, and once I get in my shower, actually go ahead and wash the pads in the shower with the hot water and my body soap. I don't really care, I'm not too fussy. And then make sure that it's rinsed really well after. And the great thing about being in the shower is you can actually see the water running clear. There's no more blood inside that water. And if you're like me, I like to smell it as well. I'd smell it. It smells clean too. And then go ahead, dry it overnight, and it's ready for use the next day. Practical. Great question. Actually, I don't believe that my pads take that long to dry. Some pads, there's different materials are used in different pads by different people. There are thousands of us who all do different things. So because we all do different things, there are different drying times for each, right? I find with mine, depending on the humidity of where you live, you don't necessarily need an actual tumble dryer to dry them. Although if you are using tumble dryer, you could do them on low heat and it won't take too long. I'm finding here, in the summer months especially, they dry pretty much overnight. If I put them outside, they'd be dry in a couple of hours. In the winter months and when it's raining outside, it does take a little bit longer to dry on the inside. I'd find a day or 2, maximum 2 days where I live, to just air dry them without any actual heat. So yeah, there are things to consider, and drying time and how often you want to wash your pads are things to consider when you're deciding how many pads you actually want to get for your whole period. I'm going to be honest and say that I have never worn a cup for up to 12 hours. I use a smaller cup anyway, and even if it's not full, I am going to empty it. But yes, I do know people who have worn for up to 12 hours. Any more questions about reusable menstrual products? We're not just talking about the pads. I'm open to answering about cups as well, and other alternatives that are out there if I know about them. Hey, another fantastic point. Did you know that there are reusable panty liners as well? And you can get those which have a little bit more absorbency as well, which can catch the drips. So it gives you more protection than those panty liners that are mainly for discharge and really light days. Urine and blood have different consistencies. So sometimes, depending on how much urine is actually coming out in those leaks, you might need a little bit more protection. One way to go about that is to get panty liners that have a PUL backing. I don't make those myself, but there are loads of sellers out there who do. And those, you can also get panty liners that have a fleece backing. Now, I do make those myself as well. At the moment, I don't have any prepared, but I should, hopefully by the time my site is back up and running, I should have more options of panty liners. Usually the panty liners I have are for really light periods days, spotting and everyday discharge, and it is absolutely something that if you're not ready to go into reusable menstrual products for your period, you can definitely start with daily use. Another point I'd like to make very quickly as well is I did have one of my customers. She's a much older lady, and she actually buys the pads that are for moderate flow and uses it for her bladder leaking, which I never really I never thought about it originally, but she actually told me the reason why she buys my pads is to actually use for her bladder leaking, as it is a bit more than what a standard panty liner would hold, or what my cotton panty liners would hold. She did try my cotton panty liners, and although it did well for a little bit of dripping here and there, actual big gushes of urine, it wasn't too effective. So she went for the moderate pads. Now, there are makers out there who do make really thin panty liners that still give you the same coverage as a moderate pad. Definitely. Or of course, you can drop me a message at some point next week, because if you're going to message now about custom orders, I don't think I have the capacity right now. I have loads of work, but you can definitely drop me a message and we can talk about a custom order, and I can make panty liners or pads specifically for your use. And if I feel that it's something out of what I actually offer and another maker might be a lot better, I'm more than happy to recommend other makers for you to try out through Etsy. They do take custom orders as well. So yeah, if it's something out of my scope, I definitely have a whole library in my head of other makers that are just so fantastic and amazing and passionate about what they do, and I would choose them any day other than ordering online from an unknown place made by people who don't really care about the cause. Yes, this is a genuine point. Not everyone gets along with cotton tops or even cotton cores. Unfortunately and fortunately, my pads are cotton top and cotton cores, but there are so many out there who use different materials. Now, I do some pads with cotton flannel tops, which tends to be a lot drier feeling, but if you generally have dry skin, you might not find that comfortable either. I also do use crushed velvet and velvet tops on some of my pads. Special ones. There are makers out there who use stuff like minky, bamboo fleece, organic cotton. I could really go through a whole list of different materials that are used for tops, and not just the tops to cores. I prefer flannel, but there are people who use microfleece, which I'm not a fan of, zorb, which I'm also not a fan of, and terry is another one, bamboo fleece for the cores as well, velour for the top. There's so much variety, and honestly, although it's worth trying me out, I recommend. I recommend my pads, of course, but don't feel limited to only one maker. There are thousands all across the world. doing this work. And you can really tell those who are passionate about it by how well they construct their pads, how good the stitching looks, how much care they've actually taken to sometimes even the placement of the patterns on the pads. It takes a lot of thought when you're doing it from a place of actual passion. So yeah, if you don't get along with my pads, that's completely fine. It's not for everyone, but don't give up on reusable menstrual products and pads. There is still more that you can try, and you can continue trying until you find what works for you. And there are groups on Facebook full of people who are willing to do swaps of used pads. I know it sounds funny, but they are willing to swap used pads so you can try for a lot less of the cost. I love using Winsett for my cores because it's lightweight, so it makes my pads appear super thin. It's mostly warm, so it doesn't have a cold, wet feeling when it's absorbing the blood. And it's breathable. It's so easy to work with. It can be a little bit messy, but it's breathable, it's lightweight, and it's warm, and it's super absorbent. So those of us new material, one of the things we do is we actually do absorbency tests and water resistance test as well, moisture resistant test to make sure this is something you can actually sew with. So I use it because lightweight, breathable, mostly warm, super absorbent. I mean, it's just, I love it. And it's what I've used for years, and I don't plan on changing that anytime soon. If you want something else, like I say, I'm not greedy, and I'm not doing this for myself. It's for you. So I see it as my job to just introduce and answer questions and advise. But at the end of the day, you're free to explore. There's hundreds and thousands of options and ways and different makers, different styles, different machines, different pad and reusable menstrual product world if you really want to. But at the same time, I understand it can be overwhelming, so I try to make it as simple as possible. This is what I have, this is what I offer. Do you want something else? Here's where you can get it. Okay. Anyway, fire away with the questions. I'm really enjoying them. Great question. So the answer to this really depends on how often you actually mean by without constantly washing your pads. I'm going to continue in the next video. So to elaborate on the previous question of how many you should get to start off with, when I say it depends how often you plan on washing, it's also depending on how many times you usually change. So if you have, let's use moderate flow for an example. If you have a moderate period, so it's not really heavy and it's not really light, and you tend to change your pad, I always tell people every 3 to 4 hours you should be changing for hygiene purposes. So if you think about it, in the day you're probably going to change about 4 or 5 times, right? Max. And then you have your overnight pad. So you times that by however many days you want to go without washing, and then you have to take into consideration the drying time as well, of if you're drying by air, if you actually have a radiator that you're going to put it on, or if you have a tumble dryer, which think about it, in the day you're probably going to change about 4 or 5 times, right? Max. And then you have your overnight pad. So you times that by however many days you want to go without washing, and then you have to take into consideration the drying time as well, of if you're drying by air, if you actually have a radiator that you're going to put it on, or if you have a tumble dryer, which you won't actually have to wait that long for drying to happen. So anyway, let's say that this moderate flow wants to do washing every 3 days, right? So you're going to do 5 pads for each day, that's 10. And then on the 3rd day, probably do the washing, right? But you still need some pads that you're going to wear on the 3rd day. So let's say 15. Now 15, and then it's going to take 1 day to dry. You probably would, or maybe not even the 1 day, it might just be the overnight pad. So let's say 16 or 17 of them. And then, yeah, so I'd say for if you're going to wash every 3 days, that's the way that you'd calculate it. If you're planning to wash at the very end of your period, and let's say you have a 5-day cycle, you do 5 by 5, and that's probably how many you need, and then you're going to wash them at the end once it's all done. Now, to be fair, you could probably get away with doing a lot less, going through a lot less pads, but like I say, I always try to advocate for proper hygiene and actually looking after yourself and looking after your pads. You want to feel fresh as possible during your period. So 3 to 4 hours generally for my moderate pads, I'd say, unless you're sleeping in them overnight, then that's another story. You change when you wake up, or if you really have to change during the night, you change during the night. I'm going to use myself as an example in the next video. So my cycle has actually changed. It used to be a lot shorter. Now it's a lot longer these days. But let's say the first day is really light for me. So I'm probably only going to go through 2 pads. The second day and the third day is pretty, there's a lot going on. So I probably go for about 5 pads on each of those days. So we've got 12 so far. I wash my pads pretty much every second day or so. So by then you've got 12, and then I've got an overnight pad or 2. So there's 14, 2 overnight pads. And so I would wash my pads on the second day, dry them overnight, and then by the following morning, I have fresh pads that are ready for me to use for the next 2 days. Does that make sense? Here's something to think about. If you find that you're actually having to change your pad more frequently than 3 to 4 hours because it's getting full really quick, it probably means that you need a higher absorbency pad or a material that is wicking faster. So if your period is really, for example, gushy, when I say gush, it comes as in, whoosh, like a proper gushing period with clots and all. Cotton tops like mine are probably not the best bet for you, but there is actually a seller on Etsy. Can't remember her full name, but I will find it for you. If you need gushing pads, send me a message and I will link you her Etsy. She does pads specially for gushing flow, and the way she's done the tops, it's got these ribs which basically helps to catch the blood really quickly so you don't have any spilling. Now, those numbers seem quite large for someone just starting up, right? Yeah, right. So, to simplify, I'd always say, look, probably just start with 4 moderate pads, 2 liners, and then 2 overnight pads. That's enough for a day or 2. And then you can kind of judge from there how much more you need of which one. And there's different ways to go about this. If you want a special if you want to talk one-on-one about your own period and your own needs and your own circumstances regarding washing, a bit access to I'm stumbling over my words, I'm tired, access to drying and all that stuff, send me a message again and we can discuss one-on-one about how to go about with your own case. Ooh, another great question. You guys are just firing them away today. Yes, I'm going to answer this in the next video because it doesn't allow me to do like blah, 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 blah. So go to the stories and watch. So staining of the pads isn't necessarily about how often you change, but I always recommend 3 to 4 hours. You should be changing anyway. Yes, you can leave them longer, but a good way to judge is 3 to 4 hours, I'd say, especially as a lot of the pads actually have patterns on there. And you know how if you're used to the disposable ones, you're used to looking down at white, so you can kind of see how much blood is actually on the pad. With a lot of the coloured ones, especially dark coloured ones, you can't really see. So 3 to 4 hours is a good judge of the average time you should be wearing your cloth pad, and then you should try to change it as frequently as possible, obviously after 3 to 4 hours, should I say. If you need to leave them longer, that's completely fine as well. What actually causes the stains, though, is not necessarily how long you leave the pad on. Although your body temperature can affect the staining of the blood, how this blood actually sets into the pads. I'm so sorry, it's been a really long day, so I'm stumbling over myself. I'm going to make this the last question for today. Anyway, so the staining isn't necessarily about how long you leave the pads on for. A lot of the times, what causes the staining is heat. Blood has basically, I'm going to use simple terms, protein. Heat cooks the protein, and the protein meaning it's going to be set stains. So if you use hot water immediately after, guess what? You're going to have a stain. If you leave the pad on for way too long and you've been running around and the weather is really, really hot and you're not changing frequently enough, you're probably going to have a harder time, removing the blood stains. If you don't really care about stains, then by all means, throw it in the hot wash straight away. But I always tell people, do the cold rinse first or the cold soak. Try to change and just take care of yourself. Some of you would actually know if you are more prone to staining even without the cold water situation. If you are more prone to staining, you would actually know. If you ever got blood on your knickers or your jeans or your skirt and you had a really hard time getting the blood out, then you're probably more prone to staining anyway. All of our body chemistry is slightly different. Your diet, your hormones, a lot of things come into play in regards to your period, right? I know with my period, even if I was to leave the blood on the pad for the whole 5 days without washing that pad, the moment I do a cold rinse and throw it into the washing machine, or even if I do a hand wash and I scrub a little bit, stain is going to come out. I don't actually have any stained pads, and if I do have any stained pads, it's only slightly. But if you do have the situation where stains do come, go to my Instagram videos. I actually have a video on there where I talked about staining of pads. I think it's blue pads. Because blue pads in particular, like a navy blue, not navy, royal blue or light blue pads, for some reason they end up holding stains a lot more. So I actually put a video on there addressing how to actually help get stains out and how to prevent the stains. So pop over to the Instagram videos. You can look through everything that's on there at the moment. And then if you still have any questions, send me a private message and we can discuss further. And like I said, I'm always open to phone calls and we can discuss your own personal circumstances.